Well, hello and welcome everyone to SMCC Online. I'm so glad that you guys are here, and I just want to take the opportunity to welcome all of our locations here. Those of you from Draper, South Jordan, Lehigh, maybe St. George, our international campus. Thank you so much for trusting us with your time today. And especially if you're new here and you're trying this out, thank you so much for coming and joining us. And I want you to know that if you have any questions, if you want to talk to any staff members or a pastor or anything, we have a way for you to do that. What you can do is open up a new tab in your browser right now and visit smccutah.org/next steps. And there's a connect form, if you just scroll down a little bit, that will allow you to connect with somebody at one of our campuses. We'd love for you to go ahead and do that. Now, today is a kind of a different day. It is a day that we call Palm Sunday. And Palm Sunday is the Sunday just at the beginning of what we would also call Holy Week. And that all might sound kind of churchy to you, but I want to explain it. So Holy Week is the week before Easter Sunday, which I'm sure you've heard of before with the Easter bunny and the eggs and the baskets with candy, but Easter has a lot more meaning to it than that. So today on Palm Sunday, 1 week before Easter, we get to read about Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. And this is something that had been prophesied about for a couple hundred years before that. In fact, we see that it's recorded from the prophet Zechariah, that he records saying that this will happen. So I want to open up to Zechariah chapter 9. It says this: "Rejoice, O people of Zion, shout in triumph, O people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious, yet he is humble, riding on a donkey." Riding on a donkey's colt. So this is important. It goes on to say, "I will remove the battle chariots from Israel and the war horses from Jerusalem. I will destroy all weapons used in battle, and your king will bring peace to the nations." So here's Zechariah prophesying about the coming Messiah, the coming king that is going to bring peace to the nations. And then what we see as we fast forward a few hundred years is in Luke's gospel. What we get to see is Luke recording what happened as Jesus entered into Jerusalem. Here's what it says. "After telling this story, Jesus went on toward Jerusalem, walking ahead of his disciples. And he came to the towns of Bethpage and Bethany on the Mount of Olives. He sent 2 disciples ahead. 'Go into the village over there,' he told them. 'As you enter it, you will see a young donkey tied there that no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks, 'Why are you untying this colt?' just say the Lord needs it." So here, this is what Zechariah had talked about hundreds of years ago, is that the Messiah would enter in on a donkey. And so they went and found the colt, just as Jesus had said. And sure enough, as they were untying it, the owners asked them, "Why are you untying that colt?" And the disciples simply replied, "The Lord needs it." So they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their garments over it for him to ride on. As he rode along, the crowd spread out their garments on the road ahead of him. When he reached the place where the road started down the Mount of Olives, all of his followers began to shout and sing as they walked along, praising God for all the wonderful miracles they had seen Jesus do. "Blessings on the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven." But some of the Pharisees among the crowd said, "Teacher, rebuke your followers for saying things like that." And he replied, "If they kept quiet, the stones along the road would burst into cheers." So what's interesting is this picture of this idea of Jesus entering in on the donkey, just as it was prophesied, and people recognizing Jesus for who he was, as the Messiah and King. And even at this time, the people who were saying all these things and shouting and cheering may not have even fully understood what that meant, but they had seen the things he had done, they'd seen the miracles he had performed, and they said, "This is the Messiah, this is King." And then on the flip side, we have the Pharisees who are saying, you can't have people talking about you like that, Jesus. They didn't like that this was happening. And so all this leads up to and really begins what we call Holy Week. And there's more to this story. And if you're unfamiliar with this, if you're unfamiliar with what happens next, I want to invite you back for Good Friday and Easter this week. And we'll talk a little bit more about these things and remember what happened with Jesus. And now what we're going to do is we are going to sing praises and sing truth about who Jesus is with our band. So I want to invite you to sing along with our band now.
You put your love on the line. that was mine, washing my river of wrong into the sea of your infinite love. With arms held high, Lord, I give my life, knowing I'm found in Christ, in your love forever. With all I am, in your grace I stand, the greatest of all romance, love of God, my Savior. Mercy roars like hurricane winds. Furious love lay waste to my sin. With arms held high, Lord, I give my life, knowing I'm found in Christ, in your love forever. With all I am, in your grace I stand, the greatest of all romance, love of God, my Savior. To the one who has rescued my soul, to the one who has welcomed me home, to the one who is Savior of all, I sing forever. To the one who has rescued my soul, to the one who has welcomed me home, to the one who is Savior of all, I sing arms held high, Lord, I give my life, knowing I'm found in Christ, in your love forever. With all I am, in your grace I stand, greatest of all romance, love of God, my Savior. To the one who has rescued my soul, to the one who has welcomed me home, to the one who is Savior of all, I sing forever. To the one who has rescued my soul, to the one who has welcomed me home, to the one who is Savior of all, I sing forever.
We're about to jump into the message with Pastor Eric, but I want to make sure I give you a quick recap here. We've been in this series called The Gospel According to Peter now for what is now 9 weeks. And specifically last week, we got to talk about this topic of failure. And if you didn't get to see it, I would really encourage you to go back and watch it. But what we get to do today is not just talk about failure, but really this big question that might have come up in your mind from last week. What happens after failure? Well, we're about to answer that question as we jump into week 9 of the Gospel According to Peter.
I don't have a funny illustration to start today. I usually don't have any funny intro. That's not meant to be funny either. We're just going to dive in because we got to pick up where we left off last week. Last week, we left off with Peter broken, head down, soul crushed. I'm Eric, by the way. I'm one of the pastors here. Special welcome to everybody at the Lehigh location. Now, I don't know if you've had a moment like that, one of those head down, soul crushed type of moments, but I have. In fact, I think most people have. Johnny Cash has. I'll tell you more about that in just a little bit, but we're going to pick up the story right there because that's where we find Peter on the tail end of, I think, the biggest failure of his life. So we're going to pick up the story. Peter is shattered, and we got to pick up right where we left off to see what happens next. So let me take you back into the story. It's only been just a few days since Jesus predicted that the disciples would walk away from him, turn their backs on him and deny him. And so it's only been a few days since Peter said, no, not me, Jesus. That's not going to be me. I will follow you to the end. And Jesus says to Peter, actually, Peter, no, you will deny me. And then he gave Peter just this little reminder, just a little way for Peter to know that Jesus knew that he had just denied him. It was this rooster crowing. And Jesus knew exactly what Peter would do. Jesus sees all. And so Jesus is arrested and he's on trial, and Peter is watching from a distance, and a young woman comes up to Peter and says, hey, Peter, aren't you with him? Aren't you one of his followers? And Peter denies it adamantly 3 times. And the 3rd time he denies him with language so strong, it would get an R rating. I mean, language out of a Tarantino film, perhaps. He denies knowing Jesus. And at that point, the rooster crows. And Peter remembers exactly what Jesus said would happen. And Peter breaks down and he weeps bitterly. Peter is ashamed. He's angry at the circumstances. He's angry at himself, and he goes off into hiding. And so with Peter in his miserable retreat, Jesus is tortured and hung on a cross. And Mark, the book we've been studying, the book of Mark, records for us what happens next in the story. With a loud cry, Mark 15, verse 37, with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. So Jesus dies on a cross. And when the centurion, the Roman centurion, the guard who was there, who stood there in front of Jesus, saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. Now that phrase, Son of God, that's how Mark opened up this book. And now here we are, some 15 chapters later, and it's that phrase that's used again. But this time, it's used by a voice that's very unlikely in the story. A Roman centurion uses this same title for Jesus, the Son of God. And at this point, Mark, the author of the Gospel of Mark, has woven this beautiful tapestry of Jesus' identity as the Son of God from the shores of the Jordan all the way to a cross outside of Jerusalem. So welcome again to the last part in a series called The Gospel According to Peter. This is part 9, and today we wrap up this study. I hope you've enjoyed this study. I mean, I've really enjoyed being in the study with you. I hope you've learned a great deal about the Gospel of Mark, 1st and 2nd Peter, letters in the end of the New Testament, and just a lot about who Peter was and what his story means for your story. Today, this whole series comes to a conclusion, and it's the type of conclusion that will set us up so well for Good Friday and Easter Sunday, where I hope you'll join us either online, but maybe better yet, if you're comfortable, in person. Today, we're going to see the restoration that happens in Peter's life after the failure I just described. We're going to see how God really restores Peter in this moment, in this season of his life. The restoration that would really set him up to be a leader, an apostle, which is an important word, means sent out one of these authoritative leaders for the church. So we'd see Peter restored to leadership. We see it in the book of Acts and beyond. Now, last week, if you weren't here, we asked a very important question. And the question was, how should we respond to our failures? How should we respond to our failures? And that's a very important question. If you missed that message, jump online and get caught up. But today we're asking a bit of a different question. In fact, I think this question is actually more important. And the question we're going to look at today, a question that I think we all deserve an answer to, is this question: how does God respond to my failure? How does God respond to my failure? And so at the end of Mark's gospel, we see some clues to how God responds. At the end of John's gospel, we see how God responds. So we're going to look into Mark. We're going to then rely heavily on John, and then we're going to look a little bit at what Peter would say years later in his life. And as we put all those together, we're really going to see how God responded to Peter's failure, and then by implication, how he responds to our failure. So with all of this in mind, let's look at how Mark ends, because the way Mark ends gives us a clue to how Peter would be restored. So let's continue on in Mark 16 now. This is the final part in the book of Mark. We started in Mark 1:1 9 weeks ago. Here we are in Mark 16. As they entered the tomb, so Jesus has died, Jesus has been buried, and as they entered the tomb, these are his followers running to the empty tomb on Easter Sunday, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified, but he is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter." Tell his disciples, but let me use a disciple's name here. Also tell Peter. He is going ahead of you. Jesus is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid, period. They were afraid, period. And this is how Mark ends. It ends so abruptly. And here we see the final mention of Peter. It's funny, it's just his name. It's tell the disciples and Peter. His name is singled out. He is singled out. And experts say this is likely happening for two reasons. Commentators say the first reason is this: because Mark got his information from Peter, it only makes sense that Peter would stand out here. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, Peter is singled out here as an indicator of what would happen next, what's to come for Peter. That Peter would be restored in some way. Maybe this is just a sign of the hope, the grace that Peter would experience. We see a glimpse of the restoration that is to come. Tell the disciples and don't forget Peter. Now, a quick side note, a little bit of a detour here. If you were following along as I read in your Bible, if you were to find a Bible and open it up to Mark 16, you would see Mark 16, verse 8, end abruptly, "They were afraid," period. And then you'd see a few more paragraphs. And you might be thinking, but Eric, you said Mark ends right here, but there's a few more paragraphs in my Bible. And if you were to look closer, you might see a little asterisk, you might see a little note. And if you would look down, you would see the editors of your translation of the Bible make a really important note. And the note might say something like this: these paragraphs are not found in the most ancient manuscripts or the oldest texts. So this is interesting. Mark ends abruptly at the end of verse 8, but there's a few extra paragraphs. Where did those come from? If they weren't in the oldest manuscripts that we have, why are they included here? And the editors, by the way, they want you to know this. They're not trying to trick you. They're not trying to fool you. They're telling you, look, this is not in the most ancient text that we have, but we think you should know about it. Now, this is interesting. What happened? Why did Mark end abruptly, and where did these paragraphs come from? Well, some people might say something like this: Mark ended abruptly because something happened to him and he wasn't able to finish his gospel. Some might say that Mark really didn't mean to end abruptly. There was more, and now we have it included, but perhaps it was damaged, and so it wasn't in the oldest texts or manuscripts. I'm not convinced by those arguments. Here's what I think happened, although I could be wrong, but I think there's good evidence pointing to this. Mark ended abruptly on purpose. They were afraid, period. And at this point, every reader is supposed to think this: what would I do if I was afraid? What would I do next? Mark ends with a cliffhanger on purpose, because a cliffhanger is designed to draw the reader in to respond on their own. I think Mark ended abruptly with a cliffhanger on purpose to draw his readers in to a response. So you might say, well, then where'd the other text come from? Well, because cliffhangers are a bit uncomfortable for a lot of people, It probably means that some people later on wanted to draw the book of Mark to a bit of a more comfortable conclusion. And so they added a few extra paragraphs. Someone close to Mark added a few extra paragraphs to make the book end a little bit more comfortably. Now, the editors, they're not trying to trick anybody. They're like, look, this wasn't in the oldest manuscripts. So here's what I think. Because those helpful paragraphs after verse 8 are still under the umbrella of helpful and hopeful truth that we know from the New Testament, we don't need to be alarmed that they're there. But at the same time, we don't have to be alarmed if we don't treat them as authoritative as the rest of Mark. So we have these extra paragraphs. Yes, they're helpful. They're not outside of the umbrella of New Testament helpful truth, but at the same time, they are outside the umbrella, in my mind, of authoritative scripture. All right. So now that we've kind of covered that unique ending to Mark, what I want to do next is jump over to the book of John, because in the book of John, we see Peter's restoration on display. Mark ended with a cliffhanger on purpose, but John takes us through the restoration that would happen with Peter. So for quite some time, I want to walk through this restoration because it's a pretty comprehensive relationship and conversation that Peter has with the risen Jesus. So afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples. After the resurrection, after the empty tomb, after the big reveal on Easter Sunday, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, that's the guy we've been studying, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Peter told them. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out, got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. So here in John, we see the story continue, okay? Jesus has been raised from the dead, and we get a glimpse into what the disciples are doing now, okay? What they're up to at this point. And they're fishing. This is fascinating to me. Why is Peter fishing? I mean, Jesus made it very clear. Peter, you are to be a fisher of men. You are to be a leader. You're to draw people into my kingdom. But now Peter is back fishing for fish or whatever type of fish they had in the Galilee. Perhaps it was salmon, probably tilapia, which was also nicknamed Peter's fish. So he's out fishing. Why is he doing this? Shouldn't he have been leading? Perhaps he was leading as he was fishing. But you don't fish all night for fun. You don't fish all night unless you are back to the career you had before you followed Jesus, the career of a fisherman. Peter is a career fisherman, and at this point, he went back to what he knew. He went back to what he was comfortable with. It's as if this whole Jesus thing has come crashing down. He's like, I tried Jesus, and it ended in a dead end for me. It's not for me. He is dead. I'm going back to everything I know. It has come to an end for me. I think Peter is fishing. I'm not sure, but I think Peter is fishing because he has gone back to what he knows. He's gone back to what he's comfortable with. He's gone back to being a fisher of fish, not a fisher of men. The whole thing has perhaps just ended for Peter. Now, this reminds me of something I hear people say often. Have you ever heard somebody say this? I tried Jesus. I tried Jesus. Have you ever heard someone say that? I've heard someone say that. I hear a lot of people say that. In fact, a lot of people come to SMCC for a season. They stop attending and they say something like, Eric, I tried Jesus and it just, for whatever reason, it wasn't for me. I like to think hard about statements like that. I tried Jesus. Because built into that statement is some unmet expectations, perhaps desires that went unfulfilled. Built into that statement is disappointment. Now, I've felt this way before with a lot of things that I tried in life. In fact, I recently tried this place in town called the Shake Shack. Talk about unmet expectations and disappointment. I mean, I was let down. It's like been there, done that, tried that, not going back. And I think Peter's in this place. And perhaps you've been in this place. Perhaps you're in this place right now, or perhaps you might see yourself in this place in the future. You know what? I'm trying Jesus. I tried Jesus. I didn't get what I wanted. He didn't give me what I was looking for. So you know what? Been there, done that. Listen, I understand this approach. You are not alone in this approach. I think you are in good company with lots and lots of people, including some of the central figures in the New Testament, central figures throughout the Bible, tried faith and said, you know what, I don't know if it's for me. But here's the thing I want you to know about this way of thinking. This way of thinking assumes Jesus is there to meet your needs. He exists for you rather than you existing for him. And if you've said, I've tried Jesus, I actually don't think you understood who Jesus was in the first place. And this story that we're going to continue to look at is an invitation to look at following Jesus again. So Peter's at this place where he's fishing, and Jesus shows up. Jesus shows up, and he's about to show Peter some grace. Let me keep reading in John. Early in the morning, so they fish all night. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore. But the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. So Jesus is on the shore. They're out fishing. They're tired from a long night of fishing. And he called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? Friends, haven't you caught anything? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Now, this moment is incredible. I don't know if you know this, but if you were to go back and do a little research into the Gospels, you would discover something. Jesus, right here, has just recreated the miracle with the same words that started the relationship with Peter years prior. This miracle of an incredible catch of fish is what got this thing started for Peter. And Jesus recreates the miracle that started it all right here to renew and to restore Peter and the relationship that he would have with Jesus again. This miracle he recreates with very similar language to let Peter know that it's actually Jesus on the shore, inviting him to a relationship again. And so when Peter thought the relationship was over, he went back to fishing. This thing is done. Jesus shows up, shows him grace and truth in a brand new way. The relationship was not too far gone, and he used the same miracle that started it to restore it. And here's what I want you to see from this moment. When it seems the relationship with Jesus is over, if you've ever felt like the relationship that you have with Jesus is coming to an end, surely it must be over. I mean, you're frustrated, you're disappointed, perhaps you're feeling like Peter felt, like a failure. In that moment, when it seems the relationship with Jesus is over, it's actually time for the relationship to grow. When it feels like it's over, it's the perfect time for the relationship to grow, because in that moment you can dive in to the grace that started the relationship in the first place. When it feels like it's over, you can throw in the towel. It seems like that's what Peter was about to do, or you can dive deeply into his grace again, and that can cause the relationship to grow. And this grace that Jesus showed Peter fueled a greater depth in the relationship than they ever had before. So I want to show you that. The conversation continues between Peter and Jesus, and the relationship grows deeper. Let's read on in John. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, so John looks over and says to Peter, it's the Lord. Like, he gets it. He sees the miracle. He hears the words. He goes, do you see what's happening? It's actually him. It's the Lord. And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it's the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off. So he puts on more clothes, a little strange, and he jumps into the water. And the other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. And when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. It's like Jesus is preparing a meal. Verse 10, Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you have just caught. So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat, dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, but even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. And none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. So this moment, there's some comedy, I think, built in. There's some humor here. I mean, Peter, we know how passionate he was. He sometimes got ahead of himself. I mean, he just cannonballs into the sea, and the disciples are watching him swim, and they just start to row in. Probably got there at about the same time. And you would think perhaps Jesus is angry because of this failure, but that's not it at all. It was time for a meal. And a meal is something you have with people that you want a relationship with. And this is what we see. We see a demonstration of grace. Jesus is not angry with Peter. He is not absent with Peter. He wants to restore the relationship. And this is how God looks at you after a failure in your life. He wants to restore the relationship. And after failure, I know what it feels like to try and approach God again. I mean, you might think he's angry. He's so mad at you, and you can't even pray because, come on, doesn't God just want to condemn you for this? That's not the case at all. And we see that in this case study with Peter. Now, this is something I've been thinking about recently. I read this article about George Clooney. George Clooney grew up in religion, and in the religion he grew up in, he would have to go confess some of his sins to the leader of the religion. And I was reading about this in a Clooney article recently where he was interviewed about his upbringing. And Clooney said in the article, you know, I would confess small things, but I never felt safe enough to confess the big things. So I would take matters into my own hands with the big things, the big sins or failures in his life. So he said this, he once read about a saint who put a pebble in their shoe so that when they walked along, they would feel the pain, and that pain reminded them of the pain of their sin, and they knew they were working off the pain of their sin as they experienced physical pain themselves. It's this form of penance. It's what penance is all about. And so Clooney, as a young boy, would fill his shoes with rocks, get on the second bunk of his bunk bed, and jump off onto the floor repeatedly to feel the pain, to feel the pain, to feel the pain, thinking he must hurt for his own sin if he's going to atone for it. But here in this story with Peter, we don't see this approach taken. Jesus has already hurt on Peter's behalf. Jesus has already felt the pain of the cross on Peter's behalf and our behalf. So now we don't have to put ourselves through some horrible pain as a form of penance to atone for what we've done. What we've done has been atoned for by what Jesus has done. And I think we see grace and we see truth in a passage like this. So the meal comes to a close, and it's very clear through this meal that Jesus wants to have a relationship with Peter and the disciples. And then the conversation continues in John, and it continues with some truth. Jesus is full of grace and truth. We've seen grace in this meal that they had together, but we're about to see truth in the conversation that they're about to have together. So here comes some truth. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, or Peter, do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than these? And the experts aren't sure what he's really referring to with the these. Do you love me more than these? Is he referring to the other disciples? Do you love me more than these guys love me? Or do you love me more than you love these people? Or perhaps some think he's pointing at the fish. Do you love me more than these? Will you follow me rather than follow a life built on this? We're not sure what the these is, but look at Peter's response. We know what that is for sure. He says, yes, Lord. Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? So this is the second time. He answered, yes, Lord, you know I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. So here we see restoration begin to happen. Take care of my sheep. Lead in such a way that people have the nourishment they need as they follow their shepherd. Verse 17, the third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He asked him the question a third time, which is interesting. Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time. So with this third question, Peter's hurt. You can see that this has done something inside of Peter, something that hurts. And he said, Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you," and he kind of paints a picture of what's to come for Peter. "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. So somehow he would be stretched out, led by others into his own death. And then Jesus said to him, "Follow me." Verse 20, Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who's going to betray you?" So referring back to the Passover meal. When Peter saw him, Peter sees John, he asked, "Lord, but what about him?" All right, this is going to happen to me, but what's going to happen to him? And look at Jesus' response. Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" What is that to you, Peter? What does that have to do with you, Peter? And then he says this, "You must follow me." What a conversation. Let's break down this conversation a little bit. If you remember, Peter's denial was threefold. He denied knowing Jesus 3 times. And now in Jesus' restoration of Peter, we see a threefold question. Threefold denial, 3 questions in the restoration. And I think these fit together. Now there's some foreshadowing about how Peter would die here in the conversation too, but he asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" And this isn't like an angry parent who's like, "Say it again, Pete, because it doesn't seem like you mean it. Do you really?" I don't think that's what Jesus is doing here at all. He asked Peter 3 times to remind Peter of the deep wound that he has from when he denied Jesus 3 times. He's going back to the failure. He's going back to the sin. He's going back to the hurt. And he's not bringing it up to hurt Peter more. He's bringing it up to heal the hurt in Peter. I want you to see this, very important. Jesus isn't bringing this up to make Peter relive the pain, but rather to relieve the pain. See, sometimes we relive our pain over and over again rather than relieve it. So Jesus doesn't bring up these wounds to wound him more. He actually puts his hands on these wounds to heal these wounds in Peter. See, Jesus was wounded for Peter. Jesus was wounded for us. And it is safe to bring our deep wounds to him. But to deal with our deep wounds, we have to bring them up. We have to address them, run them through the grid that is the gospel. We have to go back to them if we're going to heal them. And I think Jesus is asking a threefold question here about love to remind Peter of his threefold denial. He's putting his hands on the wounds to heal those wounds. So if you have deep wounds, and I think most of us do, deep wounds from something that a parent once said to you or a spouse once did to you, deep wounds from something a friend did to you, or deep wounds from the shame of what you did. If you have deep wounds, in order to process those and heal from those and move forward healthy from those, you have to go back to those. You'll have to go back to those with a trusted friend and with the grace and truth of the gospel. And I think it's time to do that. If you have wounds like that, it might be time to get with a pastor or connect with a small group leader or your friends, or perhaps if the wounds are deep, a trained, professional, licensed counselor. And it might be time to bring up the wounds again, like we see Jesus bring up the wounds with Peter, so that we can heal from those wounds in our lives. So, we had a question at the beginning of today. How does God respond to our failure? And in this story, between Jesus and Peter, we see our answer. The answer is this: God always responds to our failures with grace and truth. Grace and truth. We see grace in the story as Jesus eats a meal with his followers, with Peter. But we see truth in the story as Jesus goes back to these questions. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Grace, truth, and time. Those 3 ingredients together are what we need in our lives for transformation, and it's exactly what transformed Peter. In fact, on Easter Sunday, we're going to see a whole different Peter, a Peter who's preaching a message about the resurrection that transforms Jerusalem and the city and launches the first churches. We're going to talk about that on Easter. What led to that transformation in Peter? It's the grace, truth, and time that Jesus offered to him. Now, it's so interesting. Back in that conversation where Jesus is restoring Peter, Peter says, what about him? I mean, what about John over here? What's going to happen to him? And Jesus says, Peter, what does that have to do with you? You know what? I think it's very common for each of us to say something about that as well. Hey, I feel like I want to take my next step to follow Jesus, but what are they going to say? What are they going to think? But what about them? What about my friends if I do this? What about my spouse if I do this? What about my boyfriend or my girlfriend if I do this? What about my family if I follow? And Jesus says to Peter, do not worry about that. You keep following me. Essentially, literally it means keep on following. Continue to trust me, is what Jesus says to Peter. And I think it's what he says to us. Follow me regardless of what they do, regardless of what happens to them. So, how did Peter die? I mean, Jesus talks about it. Jesus talks about what would happen to Peter, the death that he would die. What did happen to Peter? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us, but ancient authors, so authoritative in their leadership, they're called actually church fathers, talk about what happened to Peter. One of them is named Tertullian. And Tertullian describes what happened to Peter. Let me read this to you. This is about 1,800 years old. Tertullian writes this about the death that Peter died. If you are near Italy, you have Rome, where authority is at hand for us too. Authority is at hand for us. The authorities are handing it to us, is another way to say it. What a happy church, though, that is. What a happy church that is, on which the apostles poured out their whole doctrine with their blood. They poured out their truth, supported by their poured out blood. Where Peter had a passion like that of the Lord, the passion of Jesus, his death on a cross. Peter had a passion like that. Where Paul was crowned with the death of John. John was beheaded. Paul was crowned with that type of death as well. So it seems that, once again, of course, Jesus got it right. That Peter was stretched out and he died a horrific death. So as we come to the end of this series and we sort of wrap up the book of Mark and we've looked at the end of John, how do we move forward? How do we move forward faithful after a life of failure? Is it possible? And the answer is yes. If Peter were here, he would say absolutely yes. You can be faithful after failure. And later on in his letters, 1st and 2nd Peter, Peter writes about a life of faithfulness after a life of failure. And as we read this, it will shine brightly. Like a diamond held up against black velvet, we will see incredible truth when we read it in light of Peter's failure. Look at this in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The resurrection Peter saw with his own two eyes from the dead, and into an inheritance, and look at this, that can never perish, never spoil, never fade. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming of the salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. The inheritance, that which is ours because of what Jesus has done. We bear his name, and therefore it will never perish. Salvation will never perish. It will never fade. It will never spoil. To which we might want to say, but Peter, didn't it spoil the day you failed Jesus? I mean, didn't it fade the day that you denied Jesus? Didn't it perish when you walked away from him? He would say, no, not at all. Because it is being shielded. It is being shielded by God's power. The strength of our faith is not what saves us. It's the strength of the one our faith is in that saves us. We do not shield our own salvation. Our salvation is shielded by him. And because of that, we can rest in the finished work of Jesus. And when we fail and it feels like the relationship with Jesus is finished, we should be reminded of the finished work of Jesus, which means the relationship will never perish, never spoil, it will never fade. In 1967, Johnny Cash was a sick and broken man. In 1967, Johnny Cash stumbled into Nickajack Cave. It was this cave a few miles outside of his town. The Music Men of Nashville said Johnny Cash was washed up. His career was over. I mean, he dressed in black. He was this man of mystery, and he was incredible for a long time. But eventually, he was constantly wasted. I mean, cocaine and alcohol and amphetamines. I mean, he was never sober. He had to cancel shows. He was in hospitals. He was in jails because he was so sick. And one day he left his hometown of Hendersonville, Tennessee, and said, I'm going to die. Like an animal looking for a place to die, he crawled into a cave, Nickajack Cave. He walked for as long as he could, and when he could walk no more, he got on his hands and knees and began to crawl into the darkness of the cave. And when it was completely black, and when he could move no longer, there he curled up to die. And as he was sitting there, he would later say he had a massive moment of clarity. In fact, he would describe what happened next like this. He would say this: I didn't believe it at first. I felt something very powerful, a sensation of utter peace, clarity, and sobriety. I couldn't understand it. After being awake for so long, driving my body so hard, taking so many pills, dozens of them, scores, even hundreds, how could I possibly feel all right? The feeling persisted though, and then in my mind started focusing on God. There in Nickajack Cave, I became conscious of a very clear, simple idea. I was not in charge of my destiny. I was not in charge of my own death. I was going to die at God's time, not mine. And at that point, he raised his head and began to try and find his way out of the cave. Of course, it was pitch black. He did not know where he was going. He was crawling in any direction. At one point, he felt some cold air on his back. He figured that must be an opening. He turned around. As he went in that direction, he saw light. As he walked out, June Carter was there with food and a meal. And over time, Johnny Cash followed Jesus. And over time, he became more healthy. And he would later pen songs like this. As he reemerged forgiven by God, he would write things like this: well, my goodness gracious, let me tell you the news. My head's been wet with the midnight dew. I've been down on bended knee talking to the man from Galilee. He spoke to me with a voice so sweet, I thought I heard the shuffle of angels' feet. He called my name and my heart stood still when he said, John, go do my will. After massive failure in Johnny Cash's life, it was not too late to take his next step to follow Jesus and to keep on following even after failure. So the bottom line to today's message, the bottom line really to this 9-week series is this: let's allow Jesus to heal our wounds, and then let's partner with Jesus in healing the wounded. So it's taken 9 weeks to really discover what the good news is about Jesus from Peter's perspective. But now that we've seen it, we can be sure of one thing: following Jesus is for everybody, and there's no failure that can disqualify anybody. And this is the good news that we see in Peter's life, and this is the good news that we can receive into our lives. So let me pray for us right now. Jesus, we thank you for the way that you restored Peter. And there's so much that we can learn about who you are from his restoration and his life after failure. And for those of us who are living now in light of previous failure, I pray we would find such hope in these texts in the Bible. And I pray that we would reach out to you, knowing that in you we find grace that would offer forgiveness, we find truth that would offer us life. And as we reach out to you, I pray that we would discover the relationship is never over and never finished because of the finished work that you accomplished on the cross for us. So we thank you for the transformation, the restoration we see in Peter, and we thank you for the transformation, the restoration we see in us. And if we're desperate for that now, we give you permission to offer your grace and your truth to us so that we too can have a life of faithfulness after failure. It's in your name, Jesus, that we pray. Amen.
There is a hill I cherish, where stood a precious tree. the emblem of salvation, the gift of Calvary. How is it I should profit while he is crucified? Yet as his life was taken, so I was granted mine. My wealth is in the cross. There's nothing more I want than just to know his love. My heart is set on Christ, and I will count all else as lost. The greatest of my crowns means nothing to me now, for I counted up the cost, and all my wealth is in the cross. I will not boast in riches. I have no pride in gold, but I will boast in Jesus and in his name alone. My wealth is in the cross. There's nothing more I want than just to know his love. My heart is set on Christ, and I will count all else as lost. The greatest of my crowns means nothing to me now, for I counted up the cost, and all my wealth is in the cross. All my wealth is in the cross, yeah. And when I stand in glory, my crown's before the Lord. Let this be my confession. My wealth is in the cross. My wealth is in the cross. There's nothing more I want than just to know his love. My heart is set on Christ, and I will count all else as lost. The greatest of my crowns means nothing to me now, for I counted up the cost, and all my wealth is in the cross. There's nothing more I want than just to know his love. My heart is set on Christ, and I will count all else as lost. The greatest of my crowns means nothing to me now, for I counted up the cost, and all my wealth is in the cross. All my wealth is in the cross. Yes, all my wealth is in the cross. All my wealth is in the cross.
Well, thank you again for joining us today for SMCC Online. And I just had this thought. I don't know if you've thought this yourself. Have you ever realized that life can be complicated? Have you ever thought about how religion can be complicated? Maybe even that even irreligion is complicated. Well, I want to invite you back for Easter this Sunday. We're going to be talking about how all these things can be so complicated, and yet the gospel makes it uncomplicated. So I would love to invite you back for our Easter services and even Good Friday. And you can find all the times and locations for that at smccutah.org/Easter. Thanks for being here again today, and I hope to see you on Good Friday and Easter.